The Psalter reading today comes from the 23rd Psalm, and it can be found on pages 435 to 436 in your Pew Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The gospel reading today comes from the book of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 to 34, and verses 53 to 56, and it can be found on page 818 in your Pew Bible. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And from verses 53 to 56, when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed.
Good morning. Sabbath time is important, something we often forget to honor and practice ourselves. Pastor Jonathan's taking some important Sabbath time right now. A well-known preacher remembers a friend telling her that you have to take Sabbath if only to realize that God's redeeming work in the world actually goes on fine without you. It's good to know that in your care here at Zion Church, God's work continues and will continue long after we're gone. The Bible speaks of God as the shepherd of the people. The familiar 23rd Psalm begins, "The Lord is my shepherd," and sings of God's loving care for us. And the prophet Jeremiah calls God the true shepherd, who says, "I myself will gather the remnant of my flock, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply." The shepherd metaphor comes from the book of Numbers, which just before his death, Moses called on God to name a successor who will care for the people as he had for 40 years, so they may not be like sheep without a shepherd. The Gospels emphasize the shepherd metaphor of God, especially in this morning's reading where Mark assures us that Jesus is the long-awaited shepherd like Moses, leading the people who are like sheep without a shepherd. Our reading comes just after the chilling scene of casual violence at a party in King Herod's dining room that claims the life of Jesus' mentor, John the Baptist. The disciples have just returned from their mission of teaching and healing, and they gather about Jesus in comfort and support. He listens to the disciples tell what they did on their mission trip, an exhausting experience for all of them. The crowds are so thick they're not even getting a chance to eat, so he suggests that they take a boat and go on a wilderness retreat by themselves, except that the crowds who are desperate for healing can walk and run faster than they can row the boat, and everywhere they stop, the crowd is waiting for them. And so exhausted, Jesus finally gives up and goes ashore to teach them. And he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. The Gospels tell us a lot about Jesus' compassion for people. He has compassion for a father and mother who were losing a daughter, and for a chronically ill woman he heals along the way. He meets and heals lepers. He feeds hungry crowds. He frees troubled children from demon captivity. He cares for a widow who just lost her son, her only source of support. His parable of the Good Samaritan explains the meaning of compassion for strangers. He tells us about the importance of compassion for a lost sheep and a lost brother. And he welcomes little children and says they are the true owners of the kingdom of heaven. The Gospels make sure we know that this is Jesus' purpose in the world. For God so loved the world that he gave us his only Son in order that the world might be saved through him. Mark takes us back to their history of Moses and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, and he assures us that this new prophet, this new shepherd, is here to carry on God's vocation of compassion and loving kindness, to be God's agent for them in a world of need. The shepherd is God's vocation, and compassion is how God sees the world. Jesus, God's agent in the world, looks at the people who need healing, who need food, who need freedom, who need someone to lead them and love them and be kind to them in their broken world. He looks at them with compassion as the true shepherd looking at his own flock. But is this how we see the world? There's sickness in our world. Do we see the sick and desire healing for them? There's hunger in our world. 1 in 6 people in our wealthy America are food insecure at some time. Do we see them and want them to have enough to eat? There's violence and fear in our world. Do we see people imprisoned by violence in their communities and want them to be free and safe? There's captivity in our world. Do we see people who are captive to drugs and other addictions? And do we want freedom and healing for them? There's poverty in our world. 21% of the children in our nation live in families with incomes below the poverty level. Some estimates say a third of our families don't earn enough to make ends meet, and inflation is making that so much worse. Do we feel compassion for them and want them to share our prosperity? There's racial and ethnic hatred in our world and a dark fear of foreigners, even of the ones who pick our food and put roofs on our houses. Are we willing to let them make their lives among us? Do we have the kind of compassion that Jesus had for the poor, sick, hungry, and alien people around him? When the United Church of Christ talks about social justice, we mean doing the compassionate work of Christ in a world full of need. In our safe world where we have enough to eat, access to health care, and a place to live, it's easy to forget that the core of the gospel is Jesus' teaching about compassion and caring. Jesus heals sick people wherever he goes, especially those imprisoned by mental illness and chronic disease. He has a preference for poor people, and he has harsh words for the unrepentant rich who keep them poor. His way is marked by compassion, the compassion God has for creation gone astray. Jesus tells us that what he means by social justice in his last parable. Jesus tells us what he means by social justice in his last parable in Matthew before he goes to the cross. The parable of the Last Judgment in Matthew 25. The parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus says, "Inasmuch as you have done this to the least of these, my sisters and brothers, you have done it to me." He separates people not into good and bad or liberal and conservative, but by how they treat the least of these, my family. Jesus, our brother, makes his family among those who do God's will, who hear his message of the deep desire of God for fairness and health and enough for all. It's a radical belief that God is compassionate, that God cares for everyone. It runs counter to everything our world seems to believe right now in this unsettling 21st century. It's about abundance, not scarcity, about gratitude, generosity, and reciprocity, not stinginess, selfishness, and hoarding, about kindness and graciousness, not finding fault or having the final word. Jesus speaks often about the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, God's great desire for the well-being of all of creation, including us humans, the caretakers of creation. And he calls us, his hearers, to also be believers, believing that God really loves the world, believing enough to act out our faith. As we look at the world, with all the work there is to do and how little seems to get done, let's not be discouraged. The Jewish Mishnah reminds us that the day is long and the work is great, and we're not commanded to finish the work, but neither are we allowed to desist from it. Caring for everything that's going on can seem overwhelming. But there are many ways of caring, and acts of kindness that may seem small can have life-giving and life-saving results. We know that loneliness can be health-threatening, so we can visit a friend or someone who can't get out regularly, or keep in touch with them by telephone. We can send cards to each other and keep in touch with them on social media. We can help with shopping and doctor's appointments. We can cook a meal for someone who's having a tough time. That's a long-standing tradition in some of our congregations. We can give blood if we're able, a gift that I've seen save lives firsthand. I've seen a trauma victim run through a day's donation in a few minutes. Those donations are a critical act of caring for all of us. The Red Cross and Versity blood centers are open every day, and you can make appointments online. There are many other acts of kindness that you know about that we're all capable of. There's so much more we can do, and we see the world through Jesus' eyes. Jesus says it's as simple as a kind word of welcome or a cup of cold water given in kindness. And while we have compassion for the world, let's remember to have compassion for each other as we do Christ's work right in here in our community. Let's have compassion for ourselves as we do our best to share the love of Christ right here where God has put us, remembering to practice self-care and be kind to ourselves, even when we don't feel like we did enough, or we didn't have enough time or energy, or health issues got in the way. This is what compassion means for Jesus and for us, his family and his church. It's what we call sharing the love of Christ, and we can't do that too much. Let's pray. Holy One, help us to care for all your people and for your creation as you continue to do every day. Amen.